It's my great pleasure to welcome Diana Al-Hadid. We're visiting her in her studio in Brooklyn, New York. So for her, it's morning, for us, it's evening. And this is the first time that Diana and I have sort of caught up via video, I guess, since I last saw you in spring of 2016, I think it was. Welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to have you here, and so nice to see you, Maya.
Good to see you too. And we have an audience from all around, not just from Abu Dhabi, but from all over the world, in fact. And I want to let the audience members know that if you look if you're on Zoom, you can post questions in the Q&A, and we will answer those questions towards the end of the conversation. And we're going to start by looking at the exhibition that was on view in the NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery in 2016. And Diana, maybe while I'm putting up the screen to show the images, you can talk about the beginning of the phantom limb, and we'll look at the images, and you can talk a little bit about developing this project. I think it premiered at Vienna Secession Gallery, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
and I will start that now.
Feels like centuries ago.
Only because it was. Okay, here we go. Sharing screen. Okay. So I think everyone can see that, yeah? So on the screen here, this is our archive page for the exhibition, Diana Al-Hadid, and the title of the exhibition is based on this central piece, Phantom Limb. And it was a piece that she was developing to open at the Vienna Secession Gallery. And I think that it would be great if you could just spend a minute telling us about this figure in the center, and anything that you'd like to share with us about this particular piece and your memory of it and of making it. And we'll look at images of it while we go.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so yeah, you're right. It did sort of all begin with that figure. Actually, I think my work is sort of, it is always, you know, always comes from a previous project. There's always some catalyst from a previous project for the future project. So it's sort of a generational way of working, I guess, with these projects. Like, I think of this as a continuation of a work that I did back in, I guess it was, maybe it was 2011 or 2012, called Antonym, which is actually in the promotional material, the image of me welding this figure for that work. Anyway, the way I made this was first by casting the figure in foam. She was sort of sitting on a cushion, and I was trying to describe I was trying to kind of capture her weight in this cushion. Anyway, so I just got kind of attached to the original. This was going to be disposed of. It wasn't really part of that work, but I just couldn't throw it out. In the course of making it, her arm was severed and her leg was severed, and just kind of in pulling the rubber off the mold, which was fine by me because, again, I was intending to discard it. But I get attached to the scraps in the studio, and I create these narratives for them. I think about other lives they could lead if they could just, you know, grow again or something. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember you saying this, that you were living with, so for people who are looking at the screen, this figure at the top, sort of at the top of this pyramid, it looks sort of like an ancient Greek statue, but if you were there in person up close, you could see this blue is actually part of the foam of this mold that you took, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the piece that was sitting in your studio for a long time that you became attached to.
Yeah, it was literally collecting dust into the surface of the plaster, and I just, I think that was, of course, part of, I'm a bit of a hoarder, I think, well, I've been told, and I have a hard time letting things go. So, yeah, I guess I don't know. I still do that. I still hold on to things for way too long.
And then you started to build around it in sort of, was this in response to the invitation to think about the Vienna secession project?
Yeah, in part, I was thinking about how women have been represented in paint. There were, I mean, the backstory for this show is kind of long, but that show actually was the first time that I brought together two female characters that I've been working with side by side for a long time. This figure from a Hans Memling painting called Allegory of Chastity, which is this work right there. Yeah. Or it's, you know, this diva figure. Yes. And so the central figure of Phantom Limb is a more kind of ambiguous figure that's sculptural, you know, this kind of woman in repose that, you know, sits in apparent comfort on her pedestals. So I wanted to give her a little agency, and my first instinct was still to kind of elevate her and maybe make her the peak of this mountain, but then to allow her to sort of drift off. So there's this stack, that's a good shot right there. There's a stack of pedestals, and you can see the mass in the pedestals sort of draining out. There's a kind of layers of colored foam, sediment, earth, goo. That's kind of what the plinths are, kind of the material inside the plinths. And so as she drifts off of these three plinths, she magnetically pulls the earth, the strata that's kind of been cored from the ground, from the earth with her, and new landscapes develop around her. So there's just a lot of, the narrative sort of unfolded in a lot of different directions. At the time, a lot of my larger installations had this kind of energy, or had this kind of organizing principle, where it'd be just like one element would spawn multiple narratives or material experiments, or you know, I kind of let it unfold as I'm playing with the material.
And then what I really love is that for people who haven't seen this work before, on the right-hand side, the figure coming out of the mountain, that mountain form mirrors in some ways the mountain form that you see in the central sculpture. So she's talking sort of mirroring what's near her, but in a very different format, more active and less trapped in the mountain.
Yeah, that's right. And I had the heads of all three female characters, or where her head, I guess, would be, kind of at the same parallel. Yeah. Yeah. And the other one, and the
for people who can't see it, I think she's basically in here, and then there's a mountain. Yeah.
So this show a lot of this show traveled from the Vienna Secession show, where this was first exhibited, and you brought together some other works. But the thing that that made me, yeah, and these feet. Oh, actually, go back.
We'll take a tour. In the back, you can see part of a triptych that's sort of based in paintings, and that was a separate body of work. And then this was a separate piece that is related in the sense of this part of a limb or a foot that feels related, even though it wasn't originally part of it, and cast in bronze. And then towards the back of the gallery was a loan from the Sharjah Art Foundation, which is the Gradiva's fourth wall, which also relates to the Gradiva in the beginning. And there's a figure here that comes into view from a certain perspective and then becomes completely cut apart in other perspectives. So this is a much earlier work, I think from I'm trying to remember what the date is on that. And I think that's it for our, oh yeah, here's a close-up of one of the attack pieces. And you can see the foot over there in the distance. The other thing that I was really struck by when I was getting to know your work is the way that you create the artwork in the wall. It's as if the wall is melting and revealing the artwork behind it. And I'll show, so for
the hanging panels began as a kind of architectural intervention to kind of, I've had a long-standing, I guess, quarrel with walls and actually also with the ground, with the floor that the sculptures live on. I think you know, you have that's part of that's one of the core things you have to contend with in painting, of course, is the picture plane. It's the first thing, and the same for sculpture. It's gravity, right? How does it stand up? How does it hold itself up? How does it hold you up? How does it make you move around the work? And so, for me, as the larger installations, kind of. I think of them sort of as unpacking or kind of unraveling or something, because again, I don't have a clear sense of where the work is going when I start. It starts in a very kind of intimate, small way.
Yeah.
And it remains strangely intimate and small as I work on it, because you know, they're big, but each element of the work is not repeated because it's all, you know, made by hand. It's not, you know, I don't usually like heavy, and I weld, but you know, it's all kind of custom made. So there's not a lot that's found or prefab. I use some found materials to cast into and to make work from, but it's pretty rare that I just use the existing. I have here and there, but there's always a little bit of history that I've given them. I mean, in a way, I think of the figure as sort of a found thing. I mean, it's kind of a found trope in art and historical canon.
One of the things that really jumps out at me, as you know, giving tours of artwork is one of the most interesting ways to get to know work, because I know your story of it and I know my story of it. And then every viewer that I go through it with, I start to see it through their eyes. And one of the things that happened with this piece is I started to notice more and more this, I'm going to use the annotation tool again here. Let's see if this works. The sort of sedimentation that grows up. So it looks, you know, these, what looks at first like a pedestal, when you go close, actually has layers and layers of material that at first looks ancient, and then you discover that it's got elements in it like foam and cardboard, and you know, and it's so which very contemporary materials to create this kind of ancient effect that accumulate in a way that feels extremely organic, and that tension of the contemporary and the clear historical references, but also the hand of the artist, I think was just one of the most mesmerizing aspects of this exhibition. I never got tired of looking at it. Honestly, I was so sad when we took it down. I'm going to take a quick moment because, so during this exhibition, you had your studio manager come to oversee the install, and then you came later to give a talk and a tour, and we did a lot of installing by Skype back then, the old days of Skype. Now we use Zoom. But so I wanted to show you, because you might not have seen these images from the opening night. These are our wonderful interns, students who work at the front desk to welcome people. And then you get a sense of the scale of the work when you see the people. You can see the woman in the mountain here, and the sense that the wall actually is somewhat translucent. You can see through in these gaps. And whoops, I just lost my spot. Of course, that would happen to me. Okay. Our university president admiring your work. Our former curator, our Bill Bragan. Our former vice chancellor and provost looking at the attack triptych. They look just fantastic in the sunlight. And some wonderful guests who came through. And I think that here you can get a little bit of a sense of the cardboard and the sedimentation that I was talking about in the play.
Yeah, I mean, my materials are very, very, very basic and, you know, just kind of off the shelf. They're traditionally, they're kind of traditional sculpture materials in some ways, but they're also in the more contemporary materials. They're traditional building materials and construction materials. They're the materials that are used to build the world around us. You know, they're plaster and fiberglass and steel and mold making. I mean, the same principles that build our highways and you know, all the masonry techniques. A lot of those find their way in you know, in my work. And
I think that's really important for people to realize too, because we have this sense of a preciousness of fine art. And then of course there's the tension with pop art, but yours is not engaged in that dialogue. You know, you're not saying high art, low art. It's more like real world and art kind of merge naturally together.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I mean, high art, low art, like that we grew up with that. That's in everything. I mean, it's a I think something to remember is that the forms that I'm making could not have existed but in our day today, because of the materials that are just, you know, in some ways very recent in the invention. And I'm discovering in some ways that the through line of these materials, from bronze to, you know, plaster to like these contemporary materials, every day. And in the same way that I kind of discover the narrative of the work itself, and kind of learn about things through the work, and learn about the world through the curiosities that present themselves in the work. I mean, I didn't know, for example, that you know, and this is the reason I come up with the title so late in the work so often, because I'm still waiting for the end of the story to come, you know. Right. And then, you know, for Phantom Limb, I had no idea that I would be using this severed limb from the figure, right? Like it was actually just left on the floor of the studio for the duration of making the work, for months. And I noticed that I was being extremely precious about it. Like I was, you know, tiptoeing around it. No one was allowed to move it. I just had guarded it from you know, protecting it from the traffic of the studio. And then I realized, well, there's got to be some reason I'm doing this. So I put a little tiny pedestal under it to kind of protect it, and that drew out the direction of the landscape and the narrative. And that's how I kind of thought of it, as kind of like a raft floating closer and closer to the, again, kind of in keeping with the sense of drift that's happening at the core of the sculpture, and with the narrative of drift from the Gradiva story, kind of this woman that kind of is always in motion and always moving.
I would encourage our audience also, if you don't know this work well, there's on our website now, on this archive page that we've created, you can see the brochure, which goes into greater detail with details, close-ups and things like that. You can also read the entire book, and I'm going to take a moment just to do an advertisement, the entire book. So this was a book that we put out. It's a bilingual Arabic and English. It has essays by 3 different scholars and curators talking about Diana's work from different perspectives. One is Sarah Raza, who's talking about sort of the history of her own, of Diana's practice as it relates to multiple threads of narratives in Diana's work. There's Alistair Ryder, who writes about her materials in an unbelievably nuanced way. And Reindert Falkenberg, who is a historian of Northern Renaissance art, which is very close to Diana's practice, that the work that he writes about as a historian shows up in her work. And so there's this wonderful kind of evocative dialogue or reflection that he writes about her work. And so I hope that people will go deeper into her work on this archive website. And I want to say one more thing about that install, which is that we had a different team of installers at the time. There was a guy named Sam Fakes and a woman named Zoe Qua, and they both were very instrumental in bringing this exhibition together. And I would be remiss not to thank them for the long hours that they spent getting those walls perfect.
Oh.
I just want to mention that. Oh, somebody asked a question. This is a short one. Your work uses polymer gypsum. Is that a kind of plaster?
Yeah, it's a kind of tissue Kleenex term. Like it's a general term for a kind of plaster that has a kind of resilience. It's not water based. It might be acrylic or latex based or something. So there's different kinds of companies that make that kind of material, and I'm a small expert on the differences between all of them. But there, you know, a lot of it is like architectural restoration material and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, so it's the name for what it is. It's not the brand name, in other words.
Yeah, it's just yeah, it's basically, like I said, like a modernized kind of plaster, but in principle it's the same. It works in the same way, and it looks quite similar
as plaster. Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you. All right, so now we're going to move to looking at some of the work that you've done since I last saw you, and I'm going to share my screen, but I'm going to need you to guide me to the. Is the Citadel included in the list of?
I don't see what.
1 second, almost there. Okay, here we go. All right. So here is a list. There's drawings, exhibitions, panels, sculptures, and the studio. I'm going to take a quick moment to go through the studio images because that will give us another perspective on what we just saw. So here are some views of the same studio we just walked through with work in the space. Is this work on the right here? This is related to the same figure that's in Phantom Limb, yeah?
Yes, it's an AP that I was restoring of a work called Synonym.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then here's another work in process.
Yeah, that's in the studio. Some of these will be leaving soon. So that's.
Is this the triptych we just
saw? The triptych hanging. That's right. Yeah, I needed to paint the wall over because it was really messy.
Okay.
So I took it down to paint it.
There's more, and then there's the Synonym piece again.
Yeah.
And the drawings that we were looking at.
Yeah, that's a better lit, sort of.
It's very nice.
This was what I said to you because I wasn't sure if I would be here today.
Right. And this is sort of an architectural image, it looks like.
Those are the studies for the mosaic that I made for the Penn Station renovation for the MTA. Those were the study drawings that we used to make to interpret the mosaic.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll close that one.
I tried to make them as large. Yeah, you might see images of that one. I think
Okay. Where shall we start? Here's the candle clock of the Citadel.
That's not the Citadel, if that's the one you're looking for. That would be, go to Madison Square Park exhibitions. It should be in there.
And this is the synonym piece that we were looking at earlier, yeah. Which uses the same form from Phantom Limb. It's great to see it.
Yes, that's what I mean. There's kind of, so synonym is actually an inverted process from the work antonym that I made. Mm-hmm. So antonym was made by casting on the inside, and this was made by casting on the outside mm-hmm. of the figure. So, and antonym was a unique, and this one is an addition.
Okay.
And this is kind of maybe from the opening night. So this is Citadel.
And then this is the one that you had to break open your windows to get out of your space. Can you tell us a little bit more about, it must come apart a little bit, right?
Oh yes, it comes apart in 7 pieces. I mean, it was deciding between 7 large pieces or, 12.
And so here again, we have
their images.
The figure in the mountain. Yeah.
Yes. Maybe if you want to try any of the other images from the other photographers, because this one was from the opening night and it's a little dark. There might be some other images of that work.
Cameron Blaylock?
Sure. Or maybe, yeah, any one of those. Let's see what we've got.
We'll see what. So this is kind of like going into the treat bag to see what treats we're going to find for photos.
Yeah. Okay.
There it is. Yeah, there it is again in the daytime. Very nice.
This was the first time I was able to use plantings and water in my work. I'd made work that kind of suggested the use of water. That was a really transformative experience for me in my work to kind of.
So it's actually planted in a fountain, right?
Yeah, it's not a fountain, it's a reflecting pool. But so, I was kind of doubling the work in a way, which is something I've also played with, kind of the reflection of a sculpture being, or an imagined reflection of the sculpture. Like there's a work I made ages ago called Self-Melt. And the bottom half of it is kind of like a melted, distorted version of the top half of the sculpture.
Right. And here the reflection is doing that to the actual.
Is doing that work, yeah.
That's amazing. That's beautiful.
So
this is like a separate space, yeah?
Yeah, this was a kind of hedged in room that, some of these panels that hang on the wall, they can grow to, building scale, just because they start at the same scale. They start, these small painted drips of color that I do. And then they are reinforced from the back until, and then with structure added, and until, they're strong enough to go where they need to go, So if you're gonna put something in the middle of Manhattan, they need to withstand hurricane winds and they need to be as strong as buildings. So fragile as they may look, they hold up quite well.
And the materials then can withstand rain and heat and so on, which is interesting because your work really looks like it needs serious conservation and protection. But in fact, here it is sitting outside, which is
really it needs probably the same amount of conservation and protection as any other, all outdoor sculptures need some amount of care, of course. They're living, breathing things in a way. So, but yeah, like I said, a lot of these materials, and again, I tend to be, I know the chemistry pretty well, so I kind of go for some brands over others or whatever. And it took a few years of testing at a facility that specializes in testing new materials. So just to feel comfortable with putting them outside, knowing so that I could kind of know what to expect and know how to predict the way the material would behave. And
was this the first time you'd done an outdoor sculpture then?
It was the first time that I've done a public. Yeah, I made a bronze work or two before that could go outside, but it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't a like public commission. So this was the first time that my work lived in the public realm like this, and that it was at this scale for sure. And I think part of that was really part of the reason I think I made that hedged in space, that room, was because you know, with this almost massive, you know, this is, my work is surrounded by skyscrapers, you know, it's like impossible to compete with the scale. It's really hard to make work survive at this scale. So I needed to bring the perimeter of the boundary, I guess, of that space, of the skyscrapers in a little closer, so it would invite people to come right to the surface and see the, you know, individual brush marks and get more intimate with the material and with the work. And on the other hand, I put Citadel, you know, at intentionally kind of at arm's length. You know, I surrounded it with a moat. And I, you know, in some ways, you know, people were touching these, and, you know, and that's okay, you know, it's outdoors. But in a reflecting pool, I really just wanted the work to be something that, that, yeah, you couldn't climb or touch, or it was, I wanted to get that intimacy just by studying all of the individual steel rods and how, I mean, each one of those rods of that work are uniquely kind of calibrated to draw up this mountain, the surface of the mountain. It was actually made by, I basically painted a big splashy mountain floor to ceiling in my studio. And then, and that was very, very quick. And then we cut steel rods, and I sort of traced that painted image with steel. And then I brought my welder to the wall and started to weld those rods right up against the wall and extruded it so that it grew off of the wall. So,
wow. So really, this was how the mountain was created, is that right? It was sort of
yeah. So that made like one half of the mountain, and then I did it again, and then we had two very kind of loose armatures, like, you know, steel armatures that were kind of stitched together. And then sort of over the course of 8 months or something, I just walked around the mountain, climbed it, and just started drawing up each individual steel rod to create this, to create something that was strong enough and survivable, the elements. And
is it something that still lives outside, or is it?
Yes, it would live outside if it lived on.
So I want to remind our audience members that you can ask questions of us if you're on Zoom using the Q&A box, and that we will look at a few more images of Diana's work. But I would love to hear from our audience, and I see that I can see your name, so I know some of you, and I know that we have artists watching us. So let's see what else we have. Did you work differently on these artworks, knowing that it was for a public or outdoor space? How was it different from when you are making an artwork for a museum or a confined space? Would you like to make a public work again?
Oh, I'd love to make, yes. Every time I learn something new or I have a new opportunity, it kind of, my ideas splinter off of that. So Easy answer, yes. And in some ways, there's an unpredictability that making this work totally rewired my brain for sculpture in a different way. And it was sort of in a way that I didn't really predict, or I couldn't predict. Like when I'm making a work for a museum, of course, I'm also just as mindful and and deliberate about every sight line, every composition, and how I'm building everything, and how it's going to be. If I'm expecting traffic through, coming from this door to that door, if there's an exit sign over here, whatever, like all of these things come into play. And sometimes I mark those things out in the studio, so I have a sense. And in the same way, I had a layout of the park, and I was imagining traffic, and I was imagining, that the Empire State Building was in view, and the oval, just the whole beautiful configuration of the park was something I studied obsessively to try to figure out where the work would be sited, and how
the sight lines are so important, right? Like, because in a park they can approach from any direction, but you have to choose some key sight lines of how they'll first encounter it. But also, I wonder, your audience is so different, sort of by design, from a museum, right? You go to the park for a picnic or to play. You might be somebody who also goes to a museum, but you aren't saying usually, I'm going to go to the park and look at some art. Right?
Yeah.
How much was this a factor? Like, this might be the first time somebody ever sees work by you. Did you feel kind of like, I have to do, you managed to cover a lot of ground, a lot of territory in terms of the content of your work in that installation. And I wonder if that was on your mind, this idea that somebody might never have seen your work before is going to see it for the first time.
Well, certainly I knew that there would be people that have never seen my work, and that's a thrill. It's a weird thing that for most of my life, I would dedicate, blood, sweat, and tears, everything I had into this one, into this exhibition, right? And then it would open for 2 months, and in one part of the world, in New York or Vienna or whatever, and if you happen to know about it, and if you could free up your schedule, it was like the population that ever actually made it in front of my work, to stand in front of the physical object and see it in real space, was so small. It's just an incredible thing to realize that all of this effort was to make something that so few people in the world would actually physically see in person. And my whole life's ambition is to bring people into real space, right? So this Zoom studio visit is it's the best we can do, but it's a sore approximation of what it feels like to be in front of art, as everyone knows, right? So
I think this is even more true. Some art more than others, right? Like, I think we can look at a photograph and it's definitely different in person, but your sculpture just cannot be experienced. The physicality of your sculpture has an effect on my body. Like, I walk close to it and my body, it's like when you almost bump up against a person, you feel their presence in a way that you wouldn't if you're too close to the screen talking to someone on Zoom. It's just not the same.
Yeah,
there's this real, the way that we sort of, my lizard brain experiences a three-dimensional texture, object of the kind that you make. One of the most beautiful moments, I remember giving a tour of this exhibition to somebody they had come as kind of a team building event to the exhibition, and they weren't somebody who would normally have come to see this work. And she left and she said, I can't explain what it's doing to me, but it makes me feel really weird and I love it. And I thought that was great. Awesome. I was like, that sounds like art to me, and it's fantastic.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, I love that. I love that.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I can't plan for that experience, but certainly I can. That's wonderful. Like, it's
It's yeah, and I think that the tension right now with the pandemic is that one between, we want that physical contact, but we also need to keep alive whatever we can with the art and the artists. And I think being able to talk to you and hear you talk about your work is one way that I hope that we're doing that for our audience, which have a lot of questions. Suddenly people are chatty. So I'm going to read through them because a lot of them are related, and let you kind of answer them together. Has your practice or your considered content altered during quarantine? I think that one ties into what we were just now talking about. How has your practice changed during quarantine, if it has?
I mean, it changed in that I couldn't do very much for the first month or two. But I don't know. It's too soon to know that. I really, this whole thing, I mean, we are all suffering through this enormous, it's like an enormous trauma that's inducing this, an existential crisis in all of us.
Yeah.
And there's no way of knowing the impact of it now. I really was just trying to survive. And even today, I'm just still thinking like, let's just get through, do 2 things in a day if you can. And it's hard. There's a lot. I don't know how my work has changed. I do feel like when I returned back to the studio, I felt, and maybe that was just from being made to stay away for so long, because I don't live in my studio, and I, all my equipment and my tools and my materials are here. But I came in with the fury, like, that day that I came back, I changed everything up. I turned things upside down. I cut things off. I used bright colors. I never thought,
Wow.
Cathartic. So I don't know. And I don't know if that was just from having been, restricted
Right.
for so long, but that kind of stuff also happens when you're given a new material, or a new opportunity, like working outdoors also kind of made me reorient all my priorities and everything that I knew. And I felt much less precious about certain things. And, and so, yeah, I don't know how it'll change it.
That's a very interesting, thank you for sharing that image of your first day back at the studio. That's a powerful image. We have a lot of questions about your use of materials, how they've evolved through your art career. Did you start with sculpture, or was that an exploration later in your career? And how long have you been working with materials such as gypsum? What inspired you to start experimenting with it? So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of your practice. And I'm conscious that we're coming up on the hour. If you're willing to stay on for another 10 minutes or so, we'll chat about these questions.
Yeah, I love questions about materials. That's where I start. That's where everything starts, really, for me.
Yeah.
Is knowing the materials at a very at their root, like at the DNA of the material. Like I mess with the chemistry a lot. I add additives, and they're not exotic materials. Like like I said, they're kind of the standard building materials: concrete, foams, urethanes, fiberglasses, plaster. I mean, I use the gamut, and in a lot of ways, and more recently, elements of bronze. In a lot of ways, these materials have kind of stayed, I've just kind of expanded on them, expanded on the knowledge of them. I've been working with plaster and fiberglass, and I mean, I've been carving this kind of foam since grad school. So ostensibly, you don't really know that, that anything is, that they're the same material in a way, because they're used so differently over the course of years. When I figure out a new process, I think people are surprised to know that this is the same stuff that I used to make this.
And you did train primarily in sculpture, right? That's how I think of you, but I don't know that that's actually.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know either. I do feel like, I think, I think in a very spatial way. I you know, like a lot of, I don't know how other people's minds works, but I can, you know, I rotate objects in my head. I can kind of easily see up and down. I don't know that, and I also always need to be doing something with my hands. I'm always, you know, kind of, yeah. But also I do come to the blank, you know, drawing pad a lot. Like I do these drawings I do, I've been doing, and also a very same, they change, I say they change at a glacial pace. That, you know, one year to the next, I've barely changed the materials, but they look so different. I think they, you know, the marks, the marks have a different personality that changes with my, whatever's happening in my life, maybe at that time, or,
Interesting.
yeah, they're, in the same way that the sculptures have kind of, you know, I do introduce new materials all the time, but they're kind of subtle variations on some of the old ones. And
it's interesting because it's three-dimensional work, but as you mentioned with the word mark, you're doing a lot of mark making as well as part of the object, right? So the object is often three-dimensional, even when it's on the wall. It's
often three-dimensional, but it starts almost
so much drawing. It's like you're drawing in 3 dimensions or sketching almost.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my work is built up and composed by an accumulation of vertical and horizontal planes. So whether it's like a drip of paint or a pool of material, or, you know, I use a lot of, I use gravity in a small scale to create these elements to then build up these environments. And almost all the sculptures at some point have their origin in something flat. You know, whether it's like, a long time ago, I made a work where I danced the waltz on the floor, and my footprints on the floor were the things that I used to kind of erect an upside down cathedral. And so this was like the blueprint. The work started from the ground and was extruded up. And in the same way, Citadel was painted on the wall, you know, and then, so I always need like some way to bring the work out of a flat, you know. This is my problem with the walls, right?
This is so interesting because somebody just asked a question that in a way I think you might be answering, which is, do you conceive of your sculptures first through drawings? What is the relationship between the two media in your practice? And it sounds to me like, in a way, you're constantly drawing and sculpting kind of simultaneously. Like you start flat, but it's not a drawing of a sculpture, it's a drawing that turns sculptural. Is that how you would?
Yeah. I rarely, I mean, I do some technical kind of drawings as I'm trying to kind of work out certain things, but I don't kind of have like a picture of what the sculptures are really going to look like. Very rarely. Yeah, I don't like draw them, and that's the same reason I have a hard time with maquettes, because, you know, I'm dealing with gravity and real space, and I can't, you know, do at this scale. It doesn't, the problem's not there.
So for audience members who don't know what a maquette is, think of what a dollhouse is to a building. It's a miniature version of a sculpture that allows you to see it in 3 dimensions and get a feel for the scale. And it's used often in architecture and in gallery exhibition planning. But a lot of sculptures will use maquettes to plan a sculpture, but it sounds like that's really not a factor in your process.
It's not really, and that was a big struggle when I had to kind of explain to the engineer for the park show that I was making this big sculpture, and you're gonna have to trust me that it's gonna hold.
I can't imagine that conversation, honestly.
Yeah, because, you know, they're used to like maquettes and renderings, and I just was like, I can't it would be misleading to make a small version of this, because it just wouldn't mean anything as far as the engineer, you know, there'd be no way to
calculate the engineering.
Calculate that on this scale. Yeah. it was very frustrating for that point.
Yeah. One of our artist colleagues, Noor Al-Ramahi, says it's such a privilege to see your studio tonight and to listen to you speak about your process. Your work is instantly recognizable. Do you work on or experiment with pieces that take you in a completely different direction? Do you like to explore new techniques that would not necessarily be recognized as Diana Al-Hadid?
I mean, I might surprise you and show you some work that you wouldn't guess was mine, but I feel like that actually does happen a lot, and maybe it's just what I don't know. I don't know how to separate myself from my work. Like, it's still my hand that's making all of these, and they're all the same. They're building off of experiments from previous unresolved problems in previous works. So, but yeah, I mean, I think every artist kind of comes in and has this idea that they're going to start all over from scratch, throw out everything they ever did. And yeah, I do every year, every day, try to do something that maintains my interest and does something that, it's not so much for how, like, how to get away from some existing signature look. I don't, no offense, like, care so much about how my work is seen, or recognized by the public. I just, I don't think I think about that. I think it's just me. Honestly, just maybe it's because when I'm making something, I just try to be genuine about what I'm interested in, what I'm curious in, and I am curious in how I make things just as much as other people might be curious in how I'm making things. Like, I'm kind of arriving at something in the process of making it, and so I'm not. I feel like as long as I'm doing the thing that feels genuine, and I'm just trying to respond to my own curiosities, and my own temperament and my own aggravations and my own disgust, then it will produce X work. And sometimes they do splinter off in other directions. I think they do. I mean, I always feel like I'm learning something different in each work. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it. It's very rare that I'm doing something that I'm like 100%. I'm just done it before. Like, I just have never.
It always feels like
a problem with editions so often.
Yeah.
Why are editions?
It feels like you just did one, which looks amazing, by the way.
Well, I did it, but they're all slightly different. So even in the edition, like, I kind of like, I need to build. Yeah.
But it seems like, I remember when the Attack triptych that we had in the gallery was a very new work of yours, and I actually found it kind of shocking. I was like, oh, she's going into new territory. I don't know how I feel about this, but it's still clearly your work. And yet it also feels like a radical departure. You somehow managed to keep developing without, you don't become stale, but you also don't you're not schizophrenic in your path.
I'm glad you said that, because if I go deep back into the work that I made when I just, graduated from school or just like came to New York, like, again, the materials aren't that different, but the work, I mean, I still think it looks like my work, like my early work reads like my work, but it's changed a lot, it's developed a lot. And when I made these panels, it was a natural evolution of the experiments that I was making with the materials in the sculpture. And it took a long time, and it took some convincing, actually. Like, when I sat with them for a while in my studio before they were ready to meet the world. But I had a few people, I mean, my dear champions were like, this is awesome, maybe you'll make money finally. And my other, just because, you know, it is so rare that I could make something that was that small and that kept my interest much as people.
Right. You definitely are known for these extremely large works. I think there's one more question that we haven't really gotten to yet, which is, when you're making the work, do you have a sense of how much response a particular art piece will receive, as in how much impact it will have? And it's interesting because I know that when I'm putting an exhibition together, there's usually a moment where it kind of hits me, this is going to work or this might not work. I don't know if you, beyond that, like if I can fully understand how you experience how your work is doing as it's developing.
Yeah, in some ways, yes. I know what you mean when you're like, okay, this isn't going to work or this is going to work. But it's more that I think it's going to work on me, or that it feels right from where I'm standing. And there are times where I do something and I see the future in it, like I see what will come. But that one early thing that I did, that I'm extremely excited about and think is going to change everything, and people are going to be like, wow, you know, I don't think it resonates until years later, and then people realize, you know, maybe, oh, that one weird anomalous piece actually has its place. You know, I mean, I remember when I made my first like figurative bronze, it was probably with the same kind of thinking, like, I want to make something I've never made before, totally new, totally different materials, totally everything. You know, it's whatever, everything's gonna be different now. And I'd been making these architectural installations, and I'd never worked with bronze. And then I made a work called In Mortal Repose. And it didn't look anything like anything I'd made. And I didn't know what people were doing.
It only looks like one of your works in retrospect, right?
That's like, my point. Yeah. You know, at the time I'm like, okay, this is interesting, and it feels authentic to me. Again, like it feels like I'm exploring something that I'm genuinely interested in. I'm not just making it to get out of, like, to look like some other work that's not mine. You know, like I'm, although it also didn't look like the work that I'd made before, but it felt like my work.
Right.
You know, and internally it felt like it was my work. And then now looking back, it's like so clearly kind of launched this whole other investigation. I'm still working with it now.
You know, we hear a lot of stories of artists whose galleries say, like, you know, oh, but we can't sell this because it doesn't look like your work. And I think that challenge of sort of testing and growing into new areas is can be a little daunting for very practical reasons as well. But I'm wondering, it seems like you have a really developed sense of trust in your instincts about your work.
Only in this arena.
Only in this arena. Okay. And I wonder if this is something that came to you over time, or was it there from when you first started making work? Like in graduate school, I know that for some people in their graduate program, they question all their instincts about their work, and that's a healthy thing. Mm-hmm. And what's that process been like for you, kind of coming to trust your instincts about your work, again, in the face of other people's opinions?
That's a great question. I think in grad school, it's especially hard because, and like I said, I don't invite the public to the studio very often. You know, it's and certainly not like a live video. So in part because of, you know, it is a private universe, and it's a very vulnerable place, and it's where I'm enacting a lot of bizarre instincts that or acting on a lot of bizarre instincts that maybe aren't ready for the world yet. But in grad school, you know, when you have visitor after visitor giving you contradictory advice, your only way of surviving is to make it make sense internally, right? So I did, of course, I had like every possible existential crisis when I was in grad school, but I was determined to like what I was making. And most especially, I was determined, or at least, I don't know if like, you know, like make it interesting to me, at least. I don't know if I always liked it, but I definitely, you know, that's the only way that you'll come back into the studio. So especially when I graduated and I started paying rent, that was when I thought, okay, this is really going to count. Like every day is going to count. I have to come in here excited and interested, or it has to, you know, and maybe I'm not excited actually. Maybe I'm coming in because I'm paying rent on a space and I need to, like, you know, invest my life in it and then invest my time in it, invest my thinking in it. And you just sit there for the day. And I've had a lot of days like that, you know. So
that's a really like profound way to think about it too, because the minute you start paying rent on a studio, you're making a commitment with a very sort of tangible impact,
yeah,
right?
real. No, I'm not, you know, I'm not a trust fund kid. So I, you know, I really devoted myself to that space in a way. And it's really, you know, I don't know. It is a really interesting, question.
So the last question, and we can wrap up with this one, is one that I know that you've had to answer a lot, and you have this wonderful quote from quite a while back of, you know, sort of speaking to 9/11 in New York City and what it feels like sort of to be identified as an artist and as an Arab artist and as an Arab female artist, and all these, you know, we like to pile on the, you know, the types onto the artist and then read their art through their biography. So I know that this is something that many artists encounter, unless their audience somehow reads them as neutral. And it's interesting, I think in the UAE, you read very differently probably as an artist than you might to a New York art audience, right? It's a different kind of diaspora and audience in general. But the question that our audience member has is wondering, how has your Arab heritage influenced your work? And if you feel
that's going to be another hour. It's going to be another hour.
Okay. All right. Sorry, Jyoti, it's another hour.
I'll say very briefly that because I grew up being so used to being all of these things that it was, you know, when I kind of came into New York and started to have like my work, you know, exhibited in the city and started to have like a public career, there were days where I was just surprised that anyone that this was newsworthy. You know, I was like, well, yeah, I'm a woman and I weld, so what? Like, I was used to that for a very long time, and in our little bubble, it's not so unusual. But certainly, I've come to appreciate like the statistical anomaly that is my life story, I guess. But you're really not. You know, in a lot of ways, I look to the Islamic Golden Age and to my heritage and the history of Syria, and I read what I, you know, you know, so intellectually I kind of learning along, or re-educating myself, because I wasn't taught these things in school, obviously, like or maybe it's not so obvious, but you know, my training was like modernist painters or my professors, and you know, and I love them and they're interesting. But this wasn't. It's not Western. It's not. You know, I learned the Western, primarily the Western art historical canon, right? That was. I
was wondering. So would you have ever taken an Arabic art history course or an Islamic art history course?
I don't remember there being offered one in my undergrad. I mean, I don't remember there being offered one, and I would have taken one. I'm sure I would have, but I don't remember. I mean, when I was a kid, no one knew what hummus was. You know what I mean? Like, now I go into the grocery stores and there's like hummus on the shelf. Like times have changed. Like, so I grew up like before, you know, I was in college when 9/11 hit. And I've seen the American, you know, kind of response and understanding of the Middle East change drastically over the years.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's more interesting to me as like, I feel like a bystander in it sometimes. I'm like, oh, everyone, like, this is, but of course I can't separate who I am from the work. I'm just sort of sometimes like, it catches up to me sometimes when I'm like, oh, this is, why is this interesting that a woman made this, or, you know,
Right.
some woman made this, or
Yeah.
a Syrian or an immigrant made this. Like, well, it's fair. It's fair. I guess it's interesting because it's maybe not so common. Or it is, but people don't know. I don't know.
Right. Or we're I think that we're burdened with so many sort of stereotypes and cliches that we don't see the people actually in front of us. And your artwork kind of forces everyone to kind of stop for a minute, just take a second and look. And I think that for Abu Dhabi, I think it's a very different perspective, right? We have many people from Syria here, as well as other parts of the Arab world. It's an extremely diverse Arabic speaking community.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I saw a lot of different audiences coming through to see your work and responding. And it was really, I think that the question of biography became less about your Arabic heritage and more about the fact that you were a mom, a new mom. I remember that was like a big thing, was this sort of like, how do you make these giant sculptures and you have a baby? And like, which is not that they wouldn't ask that in New York, but that here the question was more about that and less about the Arab identity.
Oh, they asked that in New York, believe me.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I know they would ask that there too, just
Yeah.
as much, but yeah. So, okay. I think we have to wrap it up. It's really nice to talk to you. And I want to thank our audience for your questions. And I think that we got to most of them. Somebody says they would love to see a dual show of you and Pat Steer. And actually, well, we'll save it. We'll wrap it up here. I could keep asking you questions all night, but thank you so much. And thank you for making us, taking us into your studio. I know that's a really big deal. And I think these are unprecedented times, so when better to go into the studio?
Yeah, exactly. I think I've been missing people here, so
yeah. Well, we're glad to be here. Thank you so much.
All right.
And we'll sign off, and I'll see audiences watch for our next exhibition, which is going to be Slavs and Tatars in a couple of weeks, and that announcement will be coming out. And everything that we've been talking about is available online on the website. Now as an archive of the exhibition. You can see all the material and read the books.
Thank you so much, Maya, and to all of you who joined. So hope to see you in the real world soon.
Me too, inshallah. Okay. Bye-bye.